Om Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnanangana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Siddhantotpalasara Nityarasikam Hamsam Vilasatmakam Audaryakya Sudhama Sevakadanam Vishram Bhakti Pradam Yachna Yukti Vichakshanam Dvagabido Vaishishta Shaktya Sada Vandeham Tripurarinamakayatim Sri Bhaktivedantinam Vanjakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Bhaktivinodaya Satchidanandanamini Gaura Shakti Swarupaya Rupanugavarayate Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratishe Namaha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Deenabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanjana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanusute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasri Shri Gaura Bhaktarinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Nama Eva Kevalam Kalau Nastyeva Nastyeva Gatiranyatha. Welcome everyone. Welcome Udurani Ananadi, Guruvakya Prabhu, Kali Yuga Pavana Prabhu. Thank you very much for translating Guruvakya and Kali Yuga Pavana. Welcome Abhay Prabhu. And I forgot what your name is, together with Abhay. Oh, yes. Yes.
Wszystkich powitał.
We're happy to be here. Thank you.
Haribol Sakyarati, Haribol Saragrahi, sitting about 4 meters away from me, but still on the screen. Haribol Pavana Prabhu, Braja Hari Prabhu, Abhay and Haripriya, Annapurna, Madan Gopal, Premarnava, David, and Surata Chandana Chachini. Kali Yuga Pavana Prabhu, which is your other account? Aha, okay. So I will give it to Sakyarati, the permission.
No. I just said that I can hear him.
Aha,
I don't
okay.
have to record. Yeah, sorry.
Because Kali Yuga Pavana Prabhu told me to give permission.
Maybe I can hear you. Maybe Bhrigu, you didn't put English. Did you? Are you on English channel?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. I hear you, but Patita Pavana is trying to talk to you, and I can hear him, but you can't.
Aha. Can you try again, Kali Yuga Pavana Prabhu? Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah. I see. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry for that. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, now I think everything is set up. So Haribol again. It's my great pleasure and my great honor to have been asked to give this talk on this day of the appearance of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. There are many things that could be said about any of the saints in our Guru Parampara. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he once said that there is more wisdom, there's more majesty, there is more glory contained in one particle of the foot dust of my spiritual master than found anywhere else in the universe. So when we hear something like this, of course, we can easily become paralyzed. What can I say? So I thought that what I would do today is to speak about the life and times of our Kedarnath Datta Bhaktivinoda. The kind of historical details that many of you will know from before, but I will also try to put it all into a historical context to highlight what are the particular glories of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Because every Vaishnava is glorious, every Vaishnava is wonderful, but every Vaishnava also has some particular glories that sometimes shine out more clearly when we compare them with others. So this is what I will try to do. And if it becomes a little bit boring, then please forgive me. I'm just trying to do my best. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was born as Kedarnath Datta 183 years ago on the 2nd of September in 1838 in a place called Ula or Birnagar. The original village was destroyed. We'll hear about that later. Today that place is known as Birnagar. It's about 100 kilometers north of Calcutta in today's West Bengal. In 1838, that area was under British rule. The British had taken over Bengal about 50 years earlier. So they were still kind of new. And he grew up in the countryside in this village, in a milieu that still wasn't very much influenced by Western culture at all. The Dattas, Datta is a very, very famous and well-known Bengali surname. It's a large family or a large family group that, according to the caste system of Bengal, are Kayasthas. Kayastha is a particular type of caste that is not found in the classical Varna-ashrama system with 4 Varnas. Kayasthas are something like scribes or clerks. They like to see themselves as Brahmins, but everybody else counts them as one type of Shudras. They are a typical example of things that started happening during the time just before Bhaktivinod was born. Society was changing in many different ways, and groups that previously hadn't been very important in society, by associating themselves with the new things happening in Indian society, they started getting more power and influence, and thus they could kind of influence their own position within the caste hierarchy. So the Kayasthas, they had already from before become kind of important by aligning themselves with different ruling powers and providing a good recruitment base for clerks, for administrators, and so on. And many of them were quite rich, and so was also the family of Kedarnath Datta. This Datta family, it's a very old family. And there's one of his ancestors had been an associate of Nityananda Prabhu, Krishnananda Datta. Another one, later on, one of his ancestors had been the founder of one of the 3 villages that later were combined into Calcutta by the British, the village of Govindapur. So this is an important and influential family that this Kedarnath was one member of. He was born there in Ula, in the countryside, and he describes something about his childhood in an autobiographical letter that he wrote much later to one of his sons, Lalita Prasad, where he tells about how it was to grow up there in the countryside, how it was to grow up in this big family mansion that they had. He led in many ways a privileged life. His father was a landowner, a jomidar. But that doesn't mean that his life was always a happy one. Already from childhood, he had lots of health problems. He had to deal with bullies in school, not only older boys, but also some of the teachers were not very nice. He tells about one teacher who was encouraging his students to steal fruits and other stuff for him. Eventually, of course, getting caught and then taking out that on the student that had been stealing and so on. So there's lots of things going on already in his childhood that made his childhood, even though it was a protected and privileged one, still a life already that was beset with difficulties. So he had his kind of eyes open to difficulties in life already as a child. Even though he was a talented child, he first went to a village school. Then when there was a possibility to move to an English medium school, he started hanging out there in the weekends or whenever he had free time. And eventually the teacher of that English school convinced his father to move him to the English school. So already at that time, there was this feeling among these Kayasthas that we should ally ourselves with these rulers. And this was typical for these Kayastha families from already before. Later on, much later, Bhaktivinod would be called a British loyalist by other people in India. They thought that he was on the side of the British against the independence movement. But Bhaktivinoda actually followed a trend that was much older than him, that was of aligning yourself with whoever is ruling and then doing your own thing at this time. There's no indication in Bhaktivinod's own writing, his autobiographical writing in this letter, that as a small child he would have been anything particularly religious. But we can't take only this letter to his son, Svalikita Jivani, or self-written life story, autobiography, literally. We can't take that as our only source for the life of this person. If we read only the Svalikita Jivani, the impression we get is of a person with religious interest, and eventually that interest will become bigger. But in many ways, a very ordinary person, complaining about different kinds of illnesses, mentioning in some place where he lives that in this place there was very good ghee to be had, so we could have luchis every day. Mentioning going for different job positions and so on, saying very little about his own internal life. Much of the internal life of Bhaktivinoda Thakur we have to learn from other sources. from his other writing in his songs and his other books, and also, of course, from the people who knew him, such as his son Bhaktisiddhanta, Bimala Prasad. But we will get to all that in due course of time. Anyway, my point is that he doesn't say much about his own spirituality in his childhood. Nevertheless, from the generations following him, we learn that he was not an ordinary soul. That is, of course, why we are celebrating today his birthday. Vaishnavas do not generally celebrate birthdays. They usually celebrate what we call the Tirobhava, or the disappearance day. I always found the English word disappearance day to be a strange word, like that person got lost or something like that. But of course, the word is used because we don't want to touch the D word. It sounds too scary. It sounds too dramatic. But the reason why we celebrate that particular day, usually when it comes to Vaishnavas, is that everybody is born in the same way. It's a bloody affair, there's crying. But then the way people pass from this world, that can be very different. If a saint passes from this world, that person is going to continue on to Krishna's Leela, whether in this world or another world. So deaths may be very different. Births are quite similar in one sense. But this isn't really true with some of the Vaishnava saints. Those that are considered to be Nitya Siddhas, that have come to this world for a particular reason. And this, of course, is what we learn that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was. He came to this world for a reason. But when in this world, he also played the part of a human being in so many ways. And to such an extent, as Guru Maharaj says when talking about Leela in general, that at times it even looks like he's forgetting his spiritual identity. So we will see when we now pass through his life that he goes through many different stages, many different changes. In a sense, many different incarnations, going from this boy in the village to eventually becoming Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So he lives there, the boy Kedarnath Datta. He lives there in the village, has a sheltered childhood. He marries when he is 12, which was quite common in those days. He marries a girl called Shaimani Mitra. Mitra is also from the Kayastha community. She was 5 at the time. And he says himself in his autobiography that this wedding was like a doll's wedding. They had no idea what they were doing, these children. They were just you sit there, you sit there, you put this garland. And then when it was over, then they went home to their own houses again and maybe got the sweet or something like that. So it was more like a betrothal ceremony. But that year, 1850, when he got married, his life changed in many very real ways. The marriage was not very real in a sense. But what was very real was that his father passed away from cholera. And not only did his father pass away, the family had also gotten into huge financial difficulties. They used to be big landowners, but the British had just recently, before that, passed new laws and new regulations for land owning. They wanted to break the power of these big landowners and distribute the land in a more fair way, which was good for many people. For others, it was a huge financial blow, and that included this Datta family. He was the oldest son who was alive. The his older brothers, they also died from cholera. He and his widow mother, they were basically alone in this huge house. And he had no idea what to do. He was a boy of 12. You can imagine being in charge of a whole family when you're 12. So a couple of years after, his uncle, Kashi Prasad Ghosh, came to visit and realized the difficulties that this boy was going through. So he ordered to take him to Calcutta to get a proper education. And this, of course, was a life-changing event for Kedarnath. Because going to Calcutta, he had been there once before, but it hadn't been a nice visit. It had been scary and weird and strange. But now, staying in the house of his uncle in central Kolkata, in Bidan Sarani, he got to see a completely different world. This uncle of his, Kashi Prasad Ghosh, was a very westernized Bengali. He had imbibed Western education, Western ideals. So staying in his house, Kedarnath also got to see a lot of Western culture and many of the new ideas that were spreading in this huge city by then. Calcutta was the British capital in India and the place where everything was happening. There were Christian missionaries there. Many of them had founded educational institutions. Kedarnath went to one of these schools. There were also others who were building churches, doing proselytization. But not only were there Christians, there were also other kind of groups that were spreading different types of spiritual teachings. Kedarnath became friends with the Tagore family in Jorasanko in Kolkata. This Tagore family was a Brahmin family, but the Brahmin family that had become somewhat polluted by some of the political dealings before. So they were considered like low-class Brahmins, which made them more free to hang out with different types of people. So Kedarnath became friends with some of these people in the Tagore family. And through them, he was introduced to a group or a religious movement that was called the Brahmo Samaj. The Brahmo Samaj means the spiritual organization or the organization of Brahman. And this was a new type of religion or a new type of teaching that had been begun already quite some time before by somebody called Ram Mohan Roy, but that was now led by Devendranath Tagore in this Tagore family. This Brahmo Samaj was a movement that tried to kind of clean Hinduism from its degenerated forms and create some kind of pure spiritual teaching. Because what was happening in this time was that all of society, all of Bengali society was going through huge changes. There were these big financial changes. The families that managed to latch themselves on to the British colonial project, such as these Kayastha families, they were becoming richer by joining themselves to Western education. They managed to secure good government jobs, good opportunities by doing business with the British. So much so that their descendants still to this day are like the upper middle classes of Bengal. But at the same time, when they were learning about European culture, European religions, they also started to look at their own traditions in a new light. And many started to feel a kind of inferiority compared to the Westerners. They felt that their own religion was maybe not as good as it should be. They were, of course, comparing their ordinary religion with the religion of the missionaries. So it's not a very fair comparison, but nevertheless, one comparison that made them look backwards, made them look strange, having weird rituals, weird mythology, and a religion that didn't look like it was keeping up to date with the changes going on in the world. So there were many reactions in this regard. Some people turned in a kind of fanatical way back to their old traditions, closing their eyes completely against anything new. Others tried to purify their own religion, such as this Brahmo Samaj, by making compromises with deism, by maybe being against image worship, by opposing many of the things that Hindu society took for granted. So through these new friends, and also through his uncle, Kashi Prasad Ghosh, Bhaktivinod was introduced to all these kind of things, to Western education, Western ideals. But then something happened again. And much of Bhaktivinod's early life is characterized by tragedy. There's the death of his father when he's only 12. And just a few years after coming to Calcutta, in 1856, a huge cholera outbreak basically wiped out all of his native village, Ula or Birnagar. His sister died. His mother almost died. And this event, when practically the whole village was destroyed, was a turning point in his life. Before that, he had been very much interested in Western civilization, in maybe getting into journalism, as his uncle was. His uncle was the editor of a big newspaper. But after this tragedy, seeing his idyllic hometown being destroyed by disease, his life seemed to take a more spiritual bent. He came in contact with Unitarian Christians, studied the writings of people like Parker, Emerson, these American transcendentalists. And some people were thinking maybe he will become a Unitarian Christian, maybe he will become a Brahmo. He didn't, but he was interested in all these things. Nevertheless, he was growing up, and his wife had moved in with him. He had the need to start to make some money for himself. It wasn't a very easy thing to do. He still didn't have that much education, and getting a good job in Calcutta was difficult. There were so many people competing for the good jobs, and especially a job that wouldn't compromise his moral integrity, because already by this time, Kedarnath had a very strong sense of moral and ethics. So he eventually accepted a teaching job in Orissa. Orissa was also a part of the British colonial enterprise in India by this time. So together with his whole family, in 1858, Kedarnath moved to a place called Chutimangal in Orissa. It's small, again, a small place, not very glorious in any way. He moved there to work as a teacher. He started out in a small school, eventually was transferred to a bigger school in Cuttack, the capital of Orissa in those days, and gradually started to be able to support his family. It was there in Chudimangal that his first son was born in 1860, Annada Prasad. And that, of course, was a joyful event for Kedarnath, the birth of his first son. But again, he's struck by tragedy, because just 10 months after that, his wife passed away. Who knows how old his wife was when she passed away? Abhay Prabhu, what are you guessing? You're still muted, so I can't hear you.
I should know this one, but I'm drawing a blank. I think she was, yeah, I'm not sure. I'll guess 20. No.
Subtract 5 years.
15. Wow.
15. That's shocking. It really says something about how society has changed in India, especially, of course. So his wife died. He's there with a small child, and he remarries. He remarries very quickly. I forget how quickly, but quickly enough to people to be scandalized. They thought that this was too soon. But of course, he had a small child that needed taking care of. So he remarries. And this time he marries a woman called Bhagavati Devi. And this second wife of his would eventually be, she would be his life companion in many, many different ways. She would, with her, he would have 13 more children. So he had 14 children all in all. And she very much was also his Sahadharmini, like the ideal Hindu wife. She shared in all of his spiritual life as well. She was initiated at the same time he was initiated. She kept in touch with his gurus in the same way he did. So they very much together worshipped Krishna for the rest of their lives. A few years later, in 1866, after having struggled as a teacher in different places and eventually getting better jobs, working as a clerk in a big company at one point. From 1866, Bhaktivinod's main kind of work career begins. In 1866, that's the year when he gets his first government job as a civil servant. The British had eventually developed a very complicated system of civil service ranks. He started out in the 6th rank, and eventually he would climb in these ranks, attaining the 2nd rank. So getting quite high up in the colonial administration. All of this meant that he had to move. He was constantly on the move. I think he and his family, they lived in 20 different places in the upcoming 30 or so years, which of course took its toll on the family in many different ways, but which was also very good for him because it made him get to see many different situations, many different places, even though it was all in the Bengal or area and around. Still, he would acquaint himself with many different types of people and many different types of understanding of life. Already from before, during this time when he was bringing up his family, starting up his family, he had become curious about the Srimad Bhagavatam. The Srimad Bhagavatam, of course, was a book that was a classic in Bengali society. Sometimes a classic is defined as a book that everybody knows but nobody has read. So the Bhagavatam was a book like this. Everybody knew some parts of it. There's the story of Prahlad, there's the story of Dhruva, there's of course Krishna and the gopis. But Bhaktivinoda had actually never seen the book. The later part of the 19th century is a time when book printing is starting in Bengal. Some books started to be printed already in the 1830s and 1840s, but books were still quite rare. And Bhaktivinod, he's still not known as Bhaktivinoda, but Kedarnath, he mentions in his autobiography that he was looking for the Bhagavatam for many years before he could find a copy. It's quite interesting. Already before that, he had been reading in the Bible and in the Quran even. He had learned some Persian also for his job. Persian was still quite important in the administration. But he hadn't been able to find a Bhagavata. But in 1868, he does. He managed to get hold of a copy of the Bhagavata Purana, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and also the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Now he mentions in his autobiography that he had at first some difficulties with the Srimad Bhagavatam. Krishna seemed like such an enjoyer. The ideal of Jesus, of the Christians, was the ideal of a person who's sacrificing everything for others, sacrificing his own life for the sake of everybody else. Krishna is just having fun, dancing with the gopis. And then it seems like when he's had his fun with them, then he leaves them and he goes on. So he seems like a kind of immoral, strange kind of God. So he had some difficulties with the Srimad Bhagavatam, but he loved the Chaitanya Charitamrita. From the beginning, he loved the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Because, of course, Mahaprabhu Sri Chaitanya Dev, not only is he the Bengali God, there were lots of Bengalis that were kind of re-finding Mahaprabhu in this era. Sometimes we hear these stories about how Bhaktivinod, he re-established Gaudiya Vaishnavism in a time when Gaudiya Vaishnavism was in such bad repute. That's a bit of an exaggeration. There were lots of people speaking about Chaitanya, preaching Vaishnavism. So we'll hear a little bit later what actually was the special thing that he did. He wasn't the only Gaudiya Vaishnava preacher in these days. But he was special in a different way that I will come to in a little while. So he had heard, of course, of Mahaprabhu before. His family wasn't the Vaishnava family. His family was a Shakta family. So they had mainly been worshipping Kali and Durga and taking part in these kind of festivities. But of course, he had heard about Krishna and he knew people who were Vaishnavas. But when he actually got to read the Chaitanya Charitamrita, he mentions that this was a huge impact and huge change in his life. And very quickly, he starts also to share what he's learned. This was 1868. And just a couple of years after, 1870, he's transferred to Puri. The Puri temple, of course, is an ancient temple. And when the British took over Orissa in the beginning of the 19th century, they also took over responsibility for the temple, the Jagannath temple. So that in the beginning, for example, when there was some Ratha Yatra or something, British soldiers would be keeping the order, and they would be marching next to the Ratha and protecting the pilgrims and so on, managing everything. Sometimes in a kind of brusque way, but still doing a fairly good job at keeping the order, at keeping everything running, until the British public kind of started to learn about this and started to criticize the government for serving Hindu gods. Our soldiers are serving Juggernaut, this terrible Hindu image. So the British had to to stop the administration of the temple, and some local Brahmins took over it again instead, with very mixed results. Lots of corruption, lots of problems coming up. So Kedarnath Datta was sent there to Orissa to help with all of these kind of things, to clean up this mess. Another thing that he did when he was there, of course, and that many of us have heard about, is how he dealt with a separatist leader, Bisha Kishen, who was claiming that he was an incarnation of Mahavishnu and who wanted to throw away the British. So Kedarnath was sent to deal with this extremist, and he managed to bring him to court at quite a bit of danger to himself and his family. But he did this feeling that this person was a fraud, claiming that he is Mahavishnu and he had had a lot of affairs with local girls and stuff. So he didn't do it just to please the British. He did it because he felt that this person was a dangerous fraud. But of course, the British felt that we can trust this Kedarnath. He took care of this threat. So they helped him advance in his career as well. And there in Puri, just 2 years after he had finally gotten hold of the Bhagavatam and gotten hold of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Kedarnath continues studying Gaudiya Vaishnavism. In Puri, of course, there were many teachers that he could study under, and he started teaching himself. In the Jagannath temple, there's a famous area called the Mukti Mandapa, where the big acharyas or the big mats are teaching, especially the Mayavad acharyas. He wasn't teaching there, but he was teaching in other places in the temple. And he was teaching nicely. This was about the time of his famous Bhagavat speech. So he was teaching about the need to go back to our own Hindu scriptures and see them in kind of a new light. But people criticized him for teaching Gaudiya Vaishnavism without being initiated, without wearing neck beads, without wearing tilak. He's some kind of upstart, people thought. There's some government guy who comes here and teaches without being authorized. In his own biography, he says that in a way this was a fair criticism. But of course, as his followers, we find it hard to think it's fair. Nevertheless, he continued studying Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and more he felt the need to get initiated himself. Initiation, of course, in one way is a matter of the heart. In one way, initiation is a formality. But initiation is also something very, very important in the life of the sadhaka. So he started looking for a guru. After a few years in Puri, he was again transferred, this time to Calcutta, which was good for him from a material point of view because he could create his own house. He called it the Bhakti Bhavan, where he could gather his family, have kind of a base for whatever he would do afterwards. Afterwards, when he was transferred to other places, he would retain that house in Kolkata and always return to that when possible. And it is also there in 1890 that Kedarnath and his wife get initiation from a Goswami from Bhagnapara, from the Bhagnapara line of spiritual teachers. His name was Bipin Bihari Goswami. He was fairly young, a little bit younger than Kedarnath himself. A very good Bhagavad speaker, very good scholar, and a descendant of, in a sense, a descendant of Nityananda. And this relationship with his spiritual teacher, Bipin Bihari Goswami, would go on for most of his life. There are some signs towards the end of his life of something happening in this relationship, but we will get to that later. It is there after his initiation that he starts one of the biggest projects of his life, and one of the projects that have really meant the most for our understanding of Bhaktivinod, and that is the Sajjana Toshani magazine. Sajjana Toshani means the one that gives delight to the good people, Sat Jana. Sajjana Toshani is not the first Vaishnava periodical in Bengal. There were some before that already. This was a time when print media was becoming more and more important in India. And the Sajjana Toshani was one of the most successful Vaishnava journals of the late 19th century. It got a wide circulation, and it went on for more than 20 years, which is a long time for periodical in those days. And in the Sajjana Toshani, Kedarnath really got to develop Vaishnava journalism in a way that nobody had done before. The Sajjana Toshani wasn't the modern journal in the sense that we could perhaps think. It's not that he went around doing interviews with people or reports from different holy places or things like that. It was mostly kind of editorial writing, but also book reviews, also responses to other people. And a big part of the Sajjana Toshani was also his own writings, serialized writing that later on then would be compiled into books. Sometimes it is said that Bhaktivinod wrote more than 100 books. That's again a little bit of a pious exaggeration, but he wrote many, many books. And not only did he write books, he also printed books that previously hadn't been printed. He edited old manuscripts, brought them out, and through the pages of this Sajjana Toshani was instrumental in really developing Vaishnavism through the print media. What is particular, of course, for this early stage of his Vaishnava activity is the way in which he's interacting with Western thought. Our Guru Maharaj sometimes calls Bhaktivinod the first Western convert. Not, of course, because he was a Western, he was Bengali in so many different ways, but Western in the sense of having really been, through his uncle, through his schooling, really been influenced by Western thought. So in his early writing, he is, for example, making the distinction between internal and external aspects of Vaishnavism. Do not be a bharavahi, he's telling his readers. Do not be a person who just carries the outer form. Instead, be a saragrahi, a person who goes for the essence. But contrary to many other reformers in those days, going for the essence didn't for Bhaktivinod mean throwing out things that other people thought were strange. Krishna's affairs with the gopis, worship of images, and so on. Rather, he would say, try to understand what's going on here. This may look strange, but is it really so? Worshipping images, for example. Do we have to think about these images as just being some man-made, crude statues, or can we see what the heart is behind it all? And all of these strange things that are going on within Vaishnavism, Bhaktivinod was very well aware of all the perversions of Vaishnavism that were going on together with this kind of renaissance of Vaishnavism that he was himself a part of creating. At the same time, there were lots of impurities within Vaishnavism. Bhaktivinod was the first to criticize all of them. He was the first to point out that this is not what Vaishnavism should be like. Things like householders taking sannyas together. So we would have like Sakyarati Swamini and Shamananda Swami, both living still together, just not having any more children, preferably after they are both sannyasis. So these kind of like strange things that people had come up with in the centuries in between Mahaprabhu and Kedarnath's time. He and others were pointing these out and trying to kind of cleanse Gaudiya Vaishnavism from these things. And it is at this time, in 1886, after beginning the Sajjanatoshani journal, that Kedarnath gets the title Bhaktivinod. He gets this title from the community of his guru Bipin Bihari Goswami, the Goswamis of Bhagnapara. They gave him this title as a recognition for the work that he's doing. Bhaktivinoda means the person who delights in bhakti. And that's really what they could see. This person, Kedarnath Datta Bhaktivinoda, he's not just sitting there and writing and thinking. He's actually delighting in bhakti himself. There's every sign that from the time of his Diksha, he engaged in regular sadhana, intensive sadhana. This is one of the things that I think is most inspiring about Bhaktivinod. I'll come back to all of this a little bit later. But that while having this larger and larger family, having all these government responsibilities, he engaged not only in Vaishnava outreach, but also in Vaishnava practice. He wrote one of his most famous books the same year that he became Bhaktivinod, Chaitanya Shikshamritam, a book in which he's really laying out his understanding of society. It's a book, I think it's available only in this translation from the Gaudiya Math in Madras, Chaitanya Shikshamritam. Very interesting book. He speaks there about, for example, Daivi Varnashrama, his understanding of Varnashrama, a Varnashrama that shouldn't be just based on birth, but primarily based on guna and karma, qualities and work. A kind of understanding of Varnashrama that he develops in this book, but that is then really taken up by his son, Bimala Prasad, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, and then given an institutional form later on. But he is the seed for this idea of the Daivi Varnashrama society. Some years later, actually immediately the year after, in 1887, another of his kind of central gifts to our sampradaya, gifts to our lineage, is revealed. 1886 was Chaitanya Shikshamritam. 1887 is when he discovers the birthplace of Mahaprabhu Sri Chaitanya. The birthplace, there's signs that it was known in the time immediately after Mahaprabhu's life. There was a temple constructed at the birthplace, the Janmasthana. That temple was then destroyed when the Hooghly River, who flows there, a distributary of the Ganges River, it changed its course and it inundated and destroyed the temple. So after that, nobody knew exactly where that birthplace of Mahaprabhu's was. There was a famous temple in the town of Navadvip, the temple of Mahaprabhu. but nobody knew where the birthplace was. So studying old maps, asking around in the area, making his own research, he started to suspect that the birthplace of Mahaprabhu was on the eastern bank of the Bhagirathi or Hooghly River, in a place that at that time was known as Mianpur or Miapur, a settlement of Muslim fishermen that no Hindus really took very seriously. But based on especially maps, Bhaktivinoda felt that this is the real birthplace of Mahaprabhu. So he acquired land there. He organized the Navadvip Dham Pracharini Shobha, and eventually founded the temple of Mahaprabhu's birthplace. And that temple is there, of course, still today, the Yogapith temple. This was a huge success for his preaching. He did everything. He fundraised. He went door to door collecting funds for the temple. He wrote about it in his own journal, in other journals, and really kind of created a buzz around this place. We have found Mahaprabhu's birthplace. That birthplace, of course, was then eventually developed by his son Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, with the support of the king of Tripura. A beautiful temple was built there, and that temple is there still today, of course, at the Yogapith in Mayapur. So Mayapur was discovered by Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He had a vision, he writes. He was there with one of his sons, Kamala, and they both saw a vision of a light coming out of this place. And he eventually brought a teacher of his to that place, Jagannath Das Babaji. He had met Jagannath Das Babaji a little bit earlier when he was in Vrindavan. Jagannath Das Babaji was a very old renunciant Vaishnava. He was infirm. He had a disciple, a very strong kind of disciple that used to carry him in a basket. Can you imagine? He was carrying him in a basket. So he was so small and shrunken and like bent like this. So he was in this basket. And they brought him there to the place that Bhaktivinoda thought perhaps was Mahaprabhu's birthplace. And when he came there, of course, the story is famous. He jumped out of the basket and he started to dance. Haribol, Haribol. This 100-year-old Babaji, or more than 100 years old. So Bhaktivinoda really felt that he had the blessings of a Siddha Mahatma in this way. Jagannath Das Babaji is a very interesting person that many things could be said about. I'll just say one thing. Do you know from where we get the Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktarinda mantra? From Jagannath Das Babaji. He's the one who comes up with, or at least who popularizes this mantra. So Bhaktivinoda and Jagannath Das Babaji, they become more and more close. And we don't know exactly why, but some years before his passing, Bhaktivinoda, he more or less retired from his active life towards the beginning of the 20th century. In 1908, he takes Babaji initiation, and eventually he passes away in 1914. But in those last years, he gets more and more close to Jagannath Das Babaji, and less close to Bipin Bihari Goswami, one of his own disciples, Krishna Das. When he writes the first biography of Bhaktivinoda after his passing, he never mentions Bipin Bihari Goswami. He only mentions Jagannath Das Babaji. And this is not a person connected with the Gaudiya Math or anything like that. So there's something that happens here. So when we look at Bhaktivinoda's life in this way, kind of from the outsider perspective, what he was doing, what books he was writing, we get the picture of an immensely competent, immensely active person who somehow has time for everything. In later hagiographical writing, we can read about how he would sleep 2.5 hours a night, and then he would do this, and then he would do that, and he would eat one chapati, and then he would eat one potato, and then he would have a little bit of milk in the evening. Maybe don't need to take that super seriously. But what nevertheless appears to us is a person who is so much delighting in bhakti, Bhaktivinoda, who so much lives and finds happiness in bhakti, that this bhakti kind of spreads from him and gives him energy for 1,000 different things. He creates this namahatta idea, kind of a system that he describes in one of his texts, how to make these kind of cells, small groups of people, and then spreading to different villages. So he makes this network of preaching centers all over Bengal. At most, I think it had about 500 branches. He writes all these books. He has this journal. And all of these things, of course, he does together with others. Sometimes we get this image that he's just alone, but he wasn't. He was cooperating with many other Vaishnavas of his day, people like Shishir Kumar Ghosh, Bipin Bihari Goswami, Madhusudan Goswami in Vrindavan. He also had help from several of his sons. Bimala Prasad, of course, but many of his other sons also helped him in his work. And he had much joy from his family, from his devoted wife, from his devoted children. He also had much sorrow from his family. His first son, his oldest son, was struggling with mental illness for most of his life. So he really, even after his initiation, even after his kind of becoming this famous Vaishnava preacher, he really had to stare suffering in the eye from beginning to end. He also had lots of health problems, lots of anxiety over different kind of exams he had to pass for different government job opportunities and so on. So he always had to kind of juggle between spiritual life and material life in many interesting ways. In many ways, he also played the part of an ordinary Bengali Kayastha householder. He arranged the marriages of all of his children to people from the same kind of caste background. Most of his descendants today, they are not strictly speaking Gaudiya Vaishnavas. They are mixing different Hindu traditions. So he wasn't successful in everything that he did. And he even laments that in one of his last writings when he had moved back to Puri in his last years. And he says that when I was young, I had so big hopes for Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But things happened and people got jealous and there were conflicts. And now, in my last days, I've come here to the land of the big waves, hoping to really finally immerse myself in proper bhajan. But again, we shouldn't take him too seriously. This might sound strange. What can be more reliable than a person writing about himself? But the fact is, we are often not the best judges of ourselves. As ordinary conditioned souls, we are illusioned. We don't see ourselves very clearly. But even the great saints don't see themselves very clearly. They are oftentimes so humble that they can't really appreciate what they are doing. Krishnadas Kaviraj, he calls himself lower than a worm in stool, which I'm sure is what he felt, but we can't see it like that. The person who wrote the Chaitanya Charitamrita cannot have been lower than a worm in stool. Similarly with Bhaktivinod. And in his songs, which is another of his major contributions, he presents the Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy in a beautiful way. And in many ways in Bengal, among his followers, it's really his songs that live on. The Gaudiya Mat is based from beginning to the end on the songs of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Those songs are the songs sung in the aratis, in the kirtans. Those songs are the songs, the texts that people quote when they are discussing scriptures. They are an immensely important gift that he gave, apart from the Sajjanatoshani, apart from Mayapur, are his songs. And of course, his other books as well. Books such as this Chaitanya Shikshamrita, Jaiva Dharma, and other texts. And these texts, they very much live on still today. His Namahatta system, it didn't stand the test of time. It worked for some time, then it kind of broke down. But of course, his son, Bimala Prasad Bhaktisiddhanta, he then created an institution that was able to carry on Bhaktivinod's legacy. And his disciples, Sridhar Maharaj, Prabhupada, and others, they were able then to pass this on in an enduring way to our Guru Maharaj. So when speaking about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in this way, it may sound like he's a historical person who gave some contribution to the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. And he was born 183 years ago, and he passed away more than 100 years ago. But we shouldn't think about Bhaktivinoda like that. We can think about him like that and appreciate that side as well. But even more important, I think, is to realize that Bhaktivinoda Thakur is our relative. Our father is our Guru Maharaj. Our grandfather is Prabhupada. Our great-grandfather is Bhaktisiddhanta. And our great-great-grandfather is Srila Satchidananda Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And you know, of course, how parents can sometimes be strict with their children. Grandparents, less often. Great-grandparents, even less often. And great-great-grandparents, they have nothing but love for their little descendants. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, we should see him like this, as this amazing person who, living the life of a householder, embodied Krishna consciousness. He sings in one of his songs, Krishnera Sangshara Koro Chori Anachar. Krishnera Sangshara Koro. Live Krishna's family life. Make your family life centered on Krishna. Chori Anachar. Give up all this kind of bad behavior, pretending you're a sannyasi while living together with your wife or anything like that. Just live a proper family life, but live it centered on Krishna. And of course, that's what he demonstrated himself. 14 children, all centered on Krishna. And he continues, Jivedoya Krishna Nam Sharra Dharma Shar. The essence of all dharma is compassion to the jivas and Krishna's name. Sometimes these two are combined together. Krishna's name, singing Krishna's name, spreading Krishna's name is real compassion to living entities. And this, of course, is emphasizing that Bhaktivinoda Thakur really is a living person still today, a person we can engage with by reading his texts, by singing his songs, by praying to him, by asking for his blessings on this day and on every day. And this is not just fanciful thinking. He himself wrote in a poem for Haridas Thakur, He reasons ill who tells that Vaishnavas die when thou art living still and sound. Vaishnavas die to live, and living try to spread the holy name around. Bhaktivinod wrote this about Haridas Thakur. But we can say with confidence and with happiness and with joy the exact same things about himself. Satchidananda Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He lived his whole life to die to the material life and be reborn as Kamala Manjari in the Nitya Lila, to serve Radha Krishna in Vrindavan, in the bowers of Vrindavan. And while living, he not only tried to spread the holy name around, he did it. And through him, through his son, through his grandson, through his great-grandson, all of these riches have come down to us. So, Jai Srila Bhaktivinod Thakur. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry I've gone over time already, but maybe there's time for a question or two. Madan Gopal Prabhu is writing here. He's writing to me. He's writing about siddhas. I mentioned that Bhaktivinoda Thakur is often seen as a nitya siddha, a person who is eternally liberated, but who has come down to this world for a particular reason. Nevertheless, when I told his life just now, it sounded very much like or maybe it sounded like a person who is struggling, who goes through different difficulties, and then kind of advances in Krishna consciousness gradually. This is an interesting question, and I'm happy you brought this out, Prabhuji. For a Westerner, we like stories about people that go through difficulties. Perhaps because it makes them easier for us to kind of relate to, but also because it makes for a better story. A story which begins with Abhay Prabhu was super holy from his birth. Then when he was young, he was super holy. Then when he was an adult, he was super holy. In old age, he was super holy. And then he passed away being super holy. That creates kind of a super holy story, but it's not very exciting. So we like stories that have their kind of ups and downs. Indians not to the same extent. There's no tragedy, for example, in Indian drama. It always has to end on a happy note. So I think partly this question, should we emphasize that the saint is Nitya Siddha or Sadhana Siddha? Is he perfect from the beginning or perfect through practice? Partly I think it's a cultural thing. And I think that when we speak about a person like Bhaktivinoda, we can stress either one. I don't think they kind of really cancel each other out, because even if he is a Nitya Siddha, even if we take that position, we can still think that in the Leela, he's so engrossed in the Leela that he forgets that. So he goes through the same kind of things that we might go through. Perhaps to show an example, but that doesn't make it any less real. He's still feeling that suffering, worrying about his son's mental health, grieving over his dead wife, grieving over his dead father, and all of these things. They are real. It's not just that he's imagining them or pretending, oh, I'm crying a little bit. It's real heartbreak. And it shows us, of course, that we can attain those things as well. Anything else?
I had one follow-up on that. I was wondering when or which sadhu came out first with the idea that Bhaktivinod was Nitya Siddha? I wasn't sure if it was Bhaktisiddhanta or if it came later on that idea came.
Bhaktisiddhanta definitely said like that, but it may have been already before him. I'm not 100% sure. For example, this disciple of Bhaktivinod's, this Krishna Das, he may have written like that as well. Bhaktivinod had several disciples. He had many disciples. Some of them would then later on work together with Bhaktisiddhanta. Not everybody, but some of them would. Bhaktisiddhanta, he collected up lots of people, also disciples of Jagannath Das Babaji, that he collected up in his preaching campaign. So I'm not sure who first said that.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
How to do it? Right now he's muted. Still doesn't work.
Maybe write it in the chat or call it like that. Yeah. I will repeat.
Okay. So, like I read that in the Kolkata, which was living in the 70s, in this Bhaktivinoda place, he was worshipping Bhrigupada religion, but then you reading about his like daily schedule, and there's not mention about worshiping. Was it his wife, or do you know a little bit more about his details?
So Saragra, he was asking about Bhaktivinod's worship of Giriraj. It's mentioned that he worshipped Giriraj in his Bhakti Bhavan in Kolkata. But then when you read about his daily schedule, there's no mention of any worship. Well, this daily schedule that we hear about, that was just for a particular time, kind of a typical day in his life at one stage of his life. So we don't know exactly. When he writes about his own kind of suggestion for how to worship in Bhajan Rahasya, how to kind of live a life of bhajan, it also has what we would call deity worship within it. So it seems to have been, especially towards the end of his life, a very important part of his own bhajan to serve Giriraj. Of course, he had a very special attachment to Radha Madhava. In many of his songs, not only in the Jaya Radha Madhava song, but many other songs, he writes about Radha Madhava. And probably this refers to images of Radha and Madhava that were there in this village in Orissa where he relocated when he was a young man, Chutimangal. These images were later found by a devotee called Fakir Mohandas, an Oriyan devotee, and they are taken care of now by some disciples of Fakir Mohan Prabhu. So those kind of Bhaktivinod's own Radha Madhava deities, they are still being worshipped. So we know something about his worship, and there are other things that we don't know so well. There's a devotee called Krishna Abhishek Das, who's a Bengali person from the same kind of background as Bhaktivinoda, Kayastha. He's done research about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and also he knows some of his Bhaktivinod's relatives, descendants in Kolkata. So he might know more about if there are any deities or anything like that in his house, because that house is still there in Kolkata. Anything else? Yes? I think you're speaking, both translators are speaking at the same time. Yeah, Guruvakya, go on. I think some issues are available online, but they are not in English. That journal was in Bengali, so that would be a big project for somebody to make them all available. I think they're all kept, like the full set, or almost the full set at least, is kept at the Bhaktivedanta Research Center in Calcutta. And I know they've put some issues online, but they're just in Bengali, so it will be difficult to read. Eventually, of course, Bhaktivinod's son, Bhaktisiddhanta, he takes over this journal and he transforms it into his English journal, The Harmonist, which also is not, I think, available in its entirety online, but that one at least you can get when it's in English. But then there was from the Spanish side also a question.
There were also questions Indian.
Thank you. That's a very good question. How do we know if somebody is a Nitya Siddha or a Sadhana Siddha? One thing we can do, of course, is we can listen to what they say themselves. That many people would take that to be the best way. What do they say themselves? But we can't always trust that. What does Mahaprabhu say when he's being called Krishna? Vishnu, Vishnu, Vishnu. Don't say things like that. So should we take him as at face value? No, no, no. We can't believe that he's God. He himself says he's not. That's not the only evidence. There's also the evidence of other saints that knew these people. We don't believe what Mahaprabhu is saying because there's overwhelming evidence from other places about him. Similarly with Bhaktivinoda Thakur, if we only read what he writes himself, we will get a picture of him that is one-sided. We also have to see what others are saying. Others here include people like his son, Bhaktisiddhanta. So there's no process, there's no formalized system that you have a book and then you check that are there these qualities and yes, no. It's something more mystical, the kind of revelations that saints have and the kind of understandings that they have. I'm not a person like that. I'm not a saint or anything special. I'm just repeating what I've heard from others. So you can see Bhaktivinod as a Nitya Siddha, or you can see him as a Sadhana Siddha. Of course, as Guru Maharaj says, the main thing is that he's a Siddha, whether it's Sadhana or Nitya Siddha. He's a Siddha, he's a perfected one that we can learn from and be inspired by. So that's the best I can answer to that question. Okay, we have gone very much over time. Thank you again, everybody. Shla Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai. Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bo. Mancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyavacha. Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Anantakode Vaishnavarindra ki jai.
Shriman Bhrigupada Prabhu ki jai.